You ever wonder if the quietest man in the room is the one everyone should fear forgetting? The laughter rolled across the polished floor of the Naval Special Warfare gym long before sunrise, echoing between climbing ropes, weight racks, and rows of neatly stacked kettlebells. The young SEAL candidates barely noticed the elderly janitor moving silently among them with a wide mop and a faded gray bucket. To them, he was simply the old guy who showed up before dawn, wiped away yesterday's sweat, nodded politely, and disappeared before the real work began. Daniel Harper never interrupted anyone. At 82 years old, his shoulders had narrowed with age, and silver hair peeked from beneath a worn Navy baseball cap that had long since lost its original color. His faded maintenance jacket hung loosely over a plain blue work shirt, and a laminated employee badge rested against his chest with nothing more remarkable than the words Facility Services printed beneath his name. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Unlock the storage closet. Mix the cleaning solution. Sweep the entrance. Mop around the benches. Replace empty towels. Say good morning if someone bothered to say it first. Most never did. This morning was no different until a young operator named Tyler Quinn decided boredom needed an audience. Leaning against a squat rack with several teammates, Tyler raised his phone, recording another short video for the private team chat. Check this out, he laughed quietly. The ghost of the gym is already clocked in. His friends chuckled as the camera followed Daniel, gliding the mop across the rubber flooring with slow, practiced movements. Someone tossed a damp towel onto the freshly cleaned surface. Another dropped an empty water bottle nearby. Daniel paused only long enough to pick them up without complaint. No irritation crossed his weathered face. No sigh escaped his lips. He simply continued working as though silence itself had become an old friend. Man never says anything, another candidate joked. Maybe he's part of the equipment. Tyler zoomed closer with the camera, hoping to capture another harmless laugh for the group. At that exact moment, Daniel reached upward to wipe fingerprints from a mirrored support column. His jacket collar shifted just enough to expose the base of his neck. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A faded black mark rested beneath his left ear, partially hidden beneath silver hair. It was not large. It was not decorative. It looked old enough to have faded into the skin itself, a simple circular design surrounding a small star. Tyler barely noticed it. Guess Grandpa had a biker phase, he laughed before ending the recording. The clip reached the team's internal group chat within seconds, earning a flood of laughing reactions and sarcastic comments. Most saw only an elderly janitor cleaning another floor. One called the tattoo a retirement home souvenir. Another joked it looked like something from an old motorcycle club. The phone continued passing from hand to hand, while Daniel quietly rinsed his mop, unaware that a 2-second glimpse of faded ink had already begun traveling far beyond the walls of the gym. Across the base, inside a conference room where tomorrow's training cycle was being reviewed, Commander Ethan Brooks glanced absent-mindedly at the notification lighting up his tablet. He almost ignored it. Almost. Then his thumb stopped. The video froze on a single frame. His eyes never settled on the old man's face. They locked instead onto the weathered symbol barely visible beneath the collar. Every conversation around the table faded into meaningless background noise as the color slowly drained from the commander's face. Commander Ethan Brooks replayed the video without blinking. Around the conference table, officers continued discussing schedules, readiness reports, and range assignments, but none of the words reached him anymore. His attention remained fixed on a faded mark that appeared for less than 2 seconds before disappearing beneath the collar of an old work shirt. It was weathered almost beyond recognition, its lines softened by decades beneath the sun, yet the shape remained unmistakable. A circle, a single star. Nothing about it belonged in any official military archive, and that was exactly why Brooks felt a chill move across his shoulders. He quietly paused the video and enlarged the image until the picture became grainy. One of the commanders beside him noticed the sudden silence. "Everything all right, sir?" Brooks did not answer immediately. He leaned closer to the screen as though afraid the image might vanish if he looked away. "Who recorded this?" he finally asked. The room exchanged puzzled glances. "One of the candidates during morning conditioning, I think," another officer replied. "Just another joke from the gym." Brooks looked up slowly. "It is not a joke." His voice was calm, but every syllable carried a weight that immediately silenced the room. He tapped the frozen image with one finger. Find out who this maintenance employee is. The officers looked at the screen again, confused. All they saw was an elderly janitor holding a mop beside a mirrored support column. One lieutenant frowned politely. Sir, should security handle it? Brooks shook his head once. No security. No questions. No attention. I want his personnel file on my desk within 15 minutes. The meeting never officially ended. It simply dissolved as officers quietly gathered their folders and hurried into the hallway. Brooks remained seated alone, watching the frozen frame another time. He remembered hearing stories many years earlier from an aging Master Chief who rarely spoke about the past. The old sailor had once said that history sometimes survived in strange ways. Not through medals, not through photographs. Sometimes it survived in the smallest symbols that were never meant to be explained. Brooks had dismissed the remark as another sea story. Now he was no longer certain. Downstairs inside the administrative office, Human Resources opened the employment database. Daniel Harper appeared almost immediately. Age, 82. Position, custodial services. Employment length, 9 years. Emergency contact, none listed. Military service, unavailable. Previous occupation, unavailable. Education, unavailable. The personnel specialist frowned. Entire sections that normally contained decades of employment history were simply blank. There was no disciplinary record because there had never been a complaint. There were no commendations, because Daniel never asked for recognition. Every supervisor had written nearly identical performance notes. Quiet, dependable, always early, never absent. Brooks read every line twice before closing the file. It was almost impossible for someone who had lived more than 8 decades to leave behind so little paperwork. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight spilled across the training compound as Daniel continued replacing fresh towels beside the exercise mats. Young operators hurried past him, discussing obstacle courses, nutrition plans, and qualification scores without giving him a second glance. One candidate offered a casual nod. Daniel smiled politely and wished him a good morning before returning to his work. His movements remained steady and unhurried, completely unaware that somewhere only a few hundred yards away, a commander with years of operational experience had abandoned an entire schedule because of one faded tattoo that should not have existed. Commander Ethan Brooks left headquarters without an escort, without notifying protocol, and without explaining his destination to anyone. That alone was enough to unsettle the officers who had worked beside him for years. He was known for precision. Every movement had a purpose. Every minute on his schedule belonged somewhere. Yet now he crossed the base on foot, carrying only a tablet containing a single frozen image that had already begun raising questions no database seemed capable of answering. A cool Atlantic breeze drifted across the training compound, carrying the familiar scent of salt air and freshly cut grass. Recruits hurried between buildings with rucksacks slung over their shoulders while instructors called out times and corrections across the obstacle course. The entire base moved with practiced efficiency, but Brooks barely noticed any of it. His attention remained fixed on one destination. Inside the gym, the morning rush had settled into its normal rhythm. Weights clanged against rubber flooring. Pull-up bars creaked beneath powerful movements. Stopwatch alarms echoed from one corner, while coaches shouted encouragement across the room. Daniel Harper quietly pushed a rolling cart, stacked with clean towels, toward the locker area. He stopped beside a drinking fountain, wiped away a ring of water, straightened a bench that someone had left crooked, then continued without drawing a single glance from the athletes surrounding him. Tyler Quinn spotted the old janitor again and smirked toward 2 teammates. Look who survived another morning, he joked. Maybe we should get him a uniform, so he can finally join training. The others laughed softly. One of them picked up a medicine ball and deliberately rolled it across the floor until it stopped directly in Daniel's path. Daniel paused, bent carefully to lift the heavy ball with both hands, and carried it back to the equipment rack without a word. There was no irritation in his expression, no disappointment, only the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to waste energy on pride. Tyler exchanged amused looks with the others. Does he even know we are making fun of him? Before anyone answered, Daniel reached for a folded towel resting high on a storage shelf. As he stretched upward, the collar of his work shirt shifted once more. The faded symbol briefly appeared beneath the silver hair at the base of his neck before disappearing again. None of the young operators recognized it. To them it was nothing more than an old tattoo blurred by time. Commander Brooks, however, had just stepped through the entrance. He stopped so suddenly that the sailor walking beside him nearly collided with his shoulder. Brooks did not blink. His breathing slowed almost imperceptibly as decades of disciplined composure concealed the surprise that surged beneath the surface. He had hoped the video might have distorted the image. Instead, seeing it with his own eyes removed every remaining doubt. The proportions were exact. The placement was exact. Even the fading followed the pattern he had once seen in a classified historical sketch locked away inside an archive that very few people had ever accessed. Brooks felt the same quiet certainty that experienced operators trusted when something invisible suddenly felt wrong. This was no coincidence. Across the room, Daniel lowered the towel onto the shelf, adjusted his collar without realizing why so many eyes had unexpectedly turned toward him, and continued polishing fingerprints from the stainless steel handrail near the entrance. He moved with the same measured rhythm as always, completely unaware that every step now carried him closer to a truth buried so deeply that even the most accomplished men on the base had spent entire careers believing it belonged only to forgotten legend. Commander Ethan Brooks did not approach immediately. Years of leadership had taught him that some answers disappeared the moment they realized they were being chased. Instead, he stood quietly near the entrance, watching Daniel Harper move from station to station with the effortless routine of a man who knew every inch of the building better than anyone wearing a uniform. Daniel wiped fingerprints from a glass display case, straightened a crooked rowing machine, and carefully folded a towel someone had carelessly tossed onto the floor. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet Brooks found himself noticing details no one else seemed to see. The old man's eyes constantly scanned the room without appearing to look at anyone directly. He instinctively stepped aside before athletes changed direction. He never blocked an exit, never turned his back completely toward an open doorway, and somehow anticipated movement several seconds before it happened. It was subtle, almost invisible beneath decades of ordinary routine, but it was there. Brooks had watched experienced operators develop those habits over entire careers. They did not come from maintenance work. They came from surviving places where awareness mattered every second. Across the weight room, Tyler Quinn noticed the commander standing unusually still. Curious, he nudged one of his teammates. "What is he looking at?" Nobody answered. Brooks slowly walked toward the cleaning cart. Daniel looked up with a polite smile that carried neither surprise nor nervousness. "Good morning, Commander," he said warmly. "I should have this area finished in another 10 minutes. Brooks nodded. "Take your time, Mr. Harper." The response caught several nearby candidates off guard. Commanders rarely addressed civilian employees by name. Daniel returned to polishing the stainless steel railing while Brooks remained beside him, pretending to study the training schedule posted on the wall. His eyes drifted once more toward the faded mark beneath the old man's collar. There it was again, softened by age, but impossible to mistake. A circle surrounding a single star, drawn with remarkable simplicity, almost as though it had never been intended to impress anyone. Brooks remembered the classified briefing from years earlier. One retired historian had referred to it only as a recognition mark, never an official insignia, never a unit patch. No records, no photographs released, no public acknowledgement. The symbol existed only in scattered testimony from men who rarely agreed on anything except one point. If you ever saw it, you were looking at someone history had quietly left behind. Brooks finally spoke, his voice low enough that only Daniel could hear. "That is an unusual tattoo." Daniel's hand paused for the first time all morning, only for a heartbeat. Then the cloth resumed its slow circles across the polished metal. "It is very old," Daniel answered. "Most people do not even notice it anymore." Brooks offered a faint smile. "I noticed." Daniel looked toward him with calm blue eyes that revealed neither concern nor curiosity. Sometimes old things stay because removing them would erase the people who gave them meaning. The sentence settled over Brooks with unexpected weight. Before he could respond, Tyler called from across the room with another careless grin. "Commander, you planning to recruit our janitor?" A few scattered laughs followed. Daniel simply lowered his cloth into the bucket and continued working exactly as before. Brooks did not laugh. His gaze remained fixed on the elderly man whose quiet answer had sounded less like nostalgia and more like a promise carried faithfully across an entire lifetime. And deep inside, he realized this conversation had only uncovered the smallest corner of a story that had never been meant to leave the shadows. Daniel Harper lowered the cleaning cloth into the bucket and gently wrung out the water. The quiet splash echoed softly beneath the steady rhythm of barbells meeting rubber mats and rowing machines humming through another morning of relentless training. Commander Ethan Brooks remained where he stood, saying nothing. The simple sentence about old things carrying the memory of old friends lingered in the air with a weight that could not be measured. Daniel reached for a fresh towel, and as he lifted his arm once more, his fingertips brushed absent-mindedly against the faded mark beneath his collar. The touch was so natural that it seemed unconscious. Yet in that single instant, the bright fluorescent lights, polished steel, and scent of fresh disinfectant quietly disappeared from his mind. Warm coastal air became heavy jungle humidity. The clean floor beneath his boots transformed into damp earth covered with fallen leaves. The distant clatter of weight plates faded into the slow rhythmic pulse of helicopter rotors somewhere beyond towering trees. He was no longer an elderly maintenance worker. He was a young man standing shoulder to shoulder with 4 others beneath a rough canvas shelter illuminated by a single lantern whose weak glow barely pushed back the surrounding darkness. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Their uniforms carried no identifying patches. Their names would never appear in newspapers, and the mission briefing they had received hours earlier had ended with a reminder that history would never officially acknowledge where they were going. An older team leader quietly placed a small metal cup over the lantern flame until only a narrow ring of light remained. From a weathered pouch, he removed a simple needle and a bottle containing dark homemade ink. One by one, the 5 men stepped forward without ceremony. No speeches were given. No promises of glory were offered. The symbol drawn onto each man's skin was almost painfully plain, a circle surrounding a single star. Anyone else would have mistaken it for meaningless artwork. To them, it represented something entirely different. Not rank, not achievement, not membership. It meant that if time erased every report, every photograph, every mission log, someone would still remember the faces sitting around that lantern. The team leader looked at each young man before speaking words Daniel had carried through every year that followed. One day, strangers may forget your names. That is acceptable. Just do not allow yourselves to forget each other. Nobody applauded. Nobody saluted. One by one, they quietly extended their hands into the center of the circle until 5 weathered palms rested together beneath the dim light. The lantern flickered as a gentle breeze moved through the shelter, carrying the scent of rain and distant ocean salt. The memory dissolved as naturally as it had arrived. Daniel blinked once and found himself standing inside the gym again with a folded towel in his hands. The polished railing reflected bright morning light instead of jungle shadows. Young operators hurried past discussing tomorrow's qualification events, unaware that an entire lifetime had passed silently behind the old man's calm blue eyes in the span of a single breath. Commander Brooks noticed something almost impossible to describe. Daniel's expression had not changed, yet it carried the quiet warmth of someone who had just visited old friends for a moment before returning alone. Brooks understood then that whatever story lay behind that faded symbol was never about secret missions or forgotten operations. It was about loyalty so enduring that even half a century later a single touch could still bring 5 young men back together, if only inside the memory of the last one left to remember. Commander Ethan Brooks waited until Daniel Harper quietly wheeled his cleaning cart toward the supply closet before speaking again. "Mr. Harper, would you mind if I asked you one more question?" Daniel stopped and rested both hands on the worn handle of the cart. His expression remained relaxed, carrying the same patient kindness that had greeted every person who crossed his path that morning. "You may ask, Commander," he answered softly. Brooks hesitated, choosing each word with unusual care. "Has anyone else ever recognized that symbol?" Daniel looked toward the polished floor for a brief moment before offering a faint smile. "Not for a very long time." The answer sounded less like secrecy and more like quiet acceptance. Brooks nodded once, thanked him, and watched the elderly man disappear through the maintenance hallway. The moment the door closed, Brooks reached for his phone. He did not call base administration. He did not contact public affairs. Instead, he selected a number stored deep inside a directory he had never expected to use again. The call connected after 2 rings. Office of Naval Special Warfare Historical Programs. Brooks lowered his voice. This is Commander Ethan Brooks. I need to verify something that may sound impossible. The civilian historian on the other end answered with practiced calm. Go ahead, Commander. Brooks described the faded circle surrounding a single star. Silence filled the line. Several long seconds passed before the historian finally spoke. Where did you see it? Brooks glanced through the hallway window toward the distant figure of Daniel carefully replacing fresh trash liners outside the locker rooms. On the neck of an 82-year-old civilian employee. Another pause followed, noticeably longer this time. Commander, the historian said carefully, please do not discuss that symbol over an unsecured telephone. I need you to contact a secure office immediately. Brooks felt his pulse quicken. So it is real. The historian answered with remarkable restraint. Some symbols belong to history. Others belong to people history was never allowed to explain. The line ended without another word. Brooks stood motionless for several moments before walking quickly toward his office. Behind him, Tyler Quinn had unknowingly witnessed part of the conversation from across the corridor. He had expected the commander to laugh about the old tattoo or dismiss it as meaningless. Instead, he had watched one of the most respected officers on the base speak with a seriousness usually reserved for operational emergencies. Curiosity slowly replaced amusement. Tyler quietly approached Petty Officer Mason Cole, who had also noticed the unusual exchange. What is going on? Tyler whispered. Mason kept watching the hallway where Daniel continued arranging folded towels with steady hands. I do not know, he admitted. But I know the commander. He does not change his schedule because of coincidences. Tyler looked back toward the elderly janitor. For the first time since meeting him, he stopped seeing an old maintenance worker. He noticed the careful posture, the calm awareness, and the quiet confidence that somehow never demanded attention. Daniel greeted another sailor passing through the hallway with the same gentle smile he had offered everyone else that morning before returning to his work, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet across the base, secure phones were beginning to ring, archived records were quietly being requested, and people who had spent entire careers studying forgotten chapters of military history were preparing to reopen files that had remained untouched for decades, all because one faded tattoo had finally been seen by the right pair of eyes. Commander Ethan Brooks closed the secure office door before placing the encrypted handset back onto its cradle. The conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes, yet it had unsettled him more than briefings that preceded overseas deployments. The historian had not dismissed the symbol. He had not questioned Brooks's judgment. Instead, he had quietly transferred the inquiry to another office whose existence was never listed on any organizational chart available to the public. Less than 3 minutes later, the secure phone rang again. Brooks answered immediately. The voice on the other end belonged to an older man whose calm authority needed no introduction. Commander Brooks? Yes, sir. I understand you encountered an elderly civilian named Daniel Harper. Brooks felt his posture straighten instinctively. Yes, sir. Do not approach him again until we speak. Brooks hesitated. Sir, may I ask who I am speaking with? A brief silence followed. Retired Admiral Charles Whitaker. Brooks recognized the name instantly. Whitaker had spent decades shaping naval special warfare doctrine before retiring almost 15 years earlier. He was not a man who involved himself in ordinary personnel matters. Sir, Brooks replied carefully, what exactly have I found? The Admiral answered with remarkable restraint. Perhaps. Not what? Perhaps who? Brooks waited. Commander, tell me one thing. Did the tattoo appear faded almost beyond recognition? Yes, sir. And was the star centered inside a simple circle? Yes, sir. Another thoughtful pause followed. Then I need you to listen very carefully. There are only a handful of people still alive who would recognize that mark without opening an archive. I happen to be one of them. Brooks felt the room become strangely quiet. Outside his office window, recruits continued jogging between training buildings while instructors blew whistles across the parade field. Life on the base moved exactly as it always had, completely unaware that history was quietly unfolding a few hundred yards away. Sir, Brooks asked softly, what should I do? Whitaker answered without hesitation. Treat Mr. Harper with the same respect you would offer any decorated veteran, but do not ask him about the symbol. If he has never volunteered its meaning in more than 50 years, he will not begin today because someone asked politely. Brooks nodded, even though the Admiral could not see him. Understood, sir. I am leaving immediately, Whitaker continued. I should arrive within 2 hours. Brooks looked at the clock in disbelief. Sir, you are personally coming here? Yes. The answer carried no drama. It sounded like the most natural decision in the world. Some meetings are worth crossing the country for. The call ended. Brooks remained motionless before slowly lowering the receiver. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper continued his routine exactly as he had every weekday for nearly a decade. He emptied recycling bins outside the classroom building, paused to hold a door open for 2 young sailors carrying equipment cases, wished them both a pleasant day, and continued toward the courtyard where fallen oak leaves had gathered along the walkway after the previous night's breeze. Tyler Quinn watched from a second-floor window, no longer laughing. Petty Officer Mason Cole stood beside him with folded arms. Do you notice something? Mason asked quietly. Tyler kept his eyes on the old janitor. What? Mason answered without looking away. Everyone else is reacting to him. He is the only person who has not changed at all. Neither man realized that vehicles were already beginning to enter the base, carrying people whose careers had been built on protecting forgotten chapters of military history, all drawn by the quiet presence of one elderly man who still believed he was simply finishing another ordinary day at work. The black government sedan rolled quietly through the front gate, without lights or ceremony. Most people on the base barely noticed it, assuming another visiting official had arrived for a routine inspection. Commander Ethan Brooks was already waiting outside headquarters when the vehicle stopped. The rear door opened, and Admiral Charles Whitaker stepped onto the pavement with measured confidence despite his 80 years. His white hair moved gently in the coastal breeze, but his posture remained unmistakably military. Brooks rendered a respectful salute. Whitaker returned it with a brief nod before asking only one question. Where is he? Brooks pointed toward the gymnasium across the courtyard. He is finishing his morning shift, sir. The Admiral did not waste another second. He crossed the courtyard at a steady pace, while Brooks followed several steps behind. Sailors passing along the sidewalks instinctively stepped aside, recognizing the retired 4-star whose reputation had become part of Naval Special Warfare history. Inside the gym, the atmosphere remained unchanged. Music played softly overhead. Candidates rotated through another training circuit while instructors monitored technique and endurance. Daniel Harper stood near the equipment room, carefully organizing fresh towels into perfectly aligned stacks. He paused only long enough to help a young sailor reach a box on the highest shelf before returning to his quiet work. Tyler Quinn noticed the Admiral entering and whispered to Mason Cole, "Why would someone like him come all the way here?" Mason could only shake his head. Neither of them had ever seen a retired 4-star appear unannounced at the gym for an ordinary weekday. Whitaker slowed as he approached Daniel. For several long seconds he said nothing. He simply studied the elderly janitor with an expression that blended disbelief, gratitude, and something much deeper. Daniel sensed someone nearby and turned politely. "Good afternoon, sir. Please watch your step. The floor is still drying." Whitaker smiled gently. "Still worrying about everyone else before yourself." Daniel looked carefully at the unfamiliar face. The Admiral had aged. The sharp features had softened. Time had left its mark on both men. Yet something in the voice stirred a memory buried beneath decades of ordinary life. Whitaker slowly rolled back the sleeve of his dress shirt. Just above his wrist rested the same faded circle surrounding a single star. It was smaller, nearly hidden beneath age spots, but unmistakably the same symbol. Daniel's hand froze around the folded towel. For the first time that day, his calm expression gave way to quiet surprise. "Charlie?" he asked almost in a whisper. Whitaker's eyes glistened as he answered with a warm smile. "It took you long enough to recognize an old friend." The room seemed to fall silent without anyone ordering it. Even the athletes lifting weights slowed as they sensed something unusual unfolding nearby. Daniel looked from the tattoo to the Admiral's face and back again, almost as though he were making certain the moment was real. Then a gentle laugh escaped him, soft and genuine, carrying decades of shared memories that needed no explanation. Whitaker stepped forward and extended both hands. Daniel accepted them warmly. No dramatic speeches followed. No crowd gathered around them. The two elderly men simply stood there smiling at one another with the quiet understanding shared only by people who had once promised never to forget. Commander Brooks remained motionless several feet away, realizing he was witnessing something no archive, no classified report, and no official history could ever fully preserve. Some bonds survived not because they were recorded, but because the people who carried them never allowed them to fade. For several quiet moments nobody spoke. The gym that usually echoed with commands, laughter, and the steady rhythm of training had become almost reverent. Tyler Quinn slowly lowered the water bottle, still resting in his hand. Around him, the other candidates stopped pretending not to watch. They had expected an explanation. Instead, they had witnessed something far more powerful. Respect had arrived without being requested. Admiral Charles Whitaker kept both hands around Daniel Harper's weathered ones before taking a single step back. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried through the silent room. Ladies and gentlemen, you have spent this entire morning training beside a man who never once asked to be recognized. Every pair of eyes settled on Daniel. The old janitor looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. He quietly adjusted the cuff of his faded work jacket and glanced toward the cleaning cart waiting beside the wall, as though he still had work left to finish. Whitaker smiled gently. Many years ago, 5 young Americans made a promise that if history forgot them, they would never forget each other. Time kept that promise alive through one man standing here today. Nobody asked for more details. Nobody asked about missions, medals, or secret operations. Somehow it no longer mattered. Commander Ethan Brooks stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Daniel. Without hesitation, he came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. The gesture was deliberate, steady, and completely sincere. One by one, the instructors followed. Then the senior enlisted leaders. Finally, the candidates themselves. Tyler Quinn was among the last. His face reddened as he realized how casually he had laughed only hours earlier. Daniel looked at the line of raised hands with quiet disbelief before returning the salute with simple dignity. There was no triumph in his expression, only gratitude. After a few moments, he lowered his hand first. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I would rather be remembered for doing today's job well than yesterday's." The words settled over the room more deeply than any speech could have. Tyler stepped forward hesitantly after the formation relaxed. "Mr. Harper," he said, his voice carrying none of the confidence it had held that morning, "I owe you an apology." Daniel smiled kindly before the younger man could continue. "You do not owe me anything, son. Just remember that every person you meet has lived a story you cannot see." Tyler nodded silently. It was a lesson he knew he would carry long after every physical challenge on the training schedule had faded into memory. Daniel reached for the handle of his cleaning cart once again. He straightened a towel lying crooked on a nearby bench, picked up an empty paper cup someone had accidentally left behind, and slowly pushed the cart toward the hallway exactly as he had done every workday for years. No escort accompanied him. No ceremony followed. The Admiral watched him disappear around the corner before quietly saying to Commander Brooks, "That is why the greatest among us are so difficult to find. They stop trying to be remembered and simply keep serving." Brooks remained standing in thoughtful silence long after Daniel had vanished from sight. The polished floor reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, spotless once again because an elderly janitor had quietly done his job with the same honor that had guided his entire life. Some names may fade from records, and some stories may never be fully told, but true character leaves its mark in the way a person serves others when nobody is watching. Some salutes last a lifetime.